Anyway, be careful. There is no underhanded dealing in this transaction, purchasing land. It is very much risky, so be careful. Please send me a regular report of the Bombay construction. I am very much anxious and will be glad to receive your regular report. Devotees in Boston, New Vrindavan, and New York received the news of Prabhupada's sudden departure with shock. He would not be visiting their temples, and they felt the impact of the stark realization that Srila Prabhupada could leave them at any moment. He was not obliged to stay with them, and they should not take his presence for granted. They had his instructions. This was sufficient. Of course, important decisions still had to be made. In Boston, the devotees had expected Prabhupada to look at a new building with them, but based on his instruction, they could become responsible and carry out his will even in his absence. The devotees who had recently received Prabhupada in their temples realized how valuable had been those moments. The personal association they had had should be relished, remembered, and acted upon. The book distributors already knew that their work was most important to Prabhupada, and that was sufficient. The press workers in Los Angeles weren't dependent on Prabhupada staying in America. They had their mission, 17 books in 2 months, and they were working day and night. Srila Prabhupada ki. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 5, Chapter 8, Text 11, the character of Bharat Maharaj. Iti Kritanusanga. Okay.
It's not Kusha, Kusama.
Oh, no, it's not that. Okay. All right, I'll just read the translation of text 11. There's no purport to text 11. Text 11 translation. Due to attachment for the deer, Maharaj Bharat lay down with it, walked about with it, bathed with it, and even ate with it. Thus his heart became bound to the deer in affection. Text 12. Kusha kusuma samit palasha palamalo dekanya harishyamano vrikashala vrikadibyo bayam asangashamano yada saha harina kunakena vanam samavishati. Please repeat. Kusha, a kind of grass required for ritualistic ceremonies. Kusuma, flowers. Samit, firewood. Palasha, leaves. Palamula, fruits and roots. Udakani, and water. Aharishyamana, desiring to collect. Vrikasala vrika, from wolves and dogs. Adibya, and other animals, such as tigers. Payam, fear. Asansamana, doubting. Yada, when. Saha, with. Harinakunakena, the deer calf. Vanam,
Vanam,
the forest.
forest.
Samavishati,
Samavishati,
enters.
enters.
Translation. When Maharaj Bharat wanted to enter the forest to collect kusha grass, flowers, wood, leaves, fruits, roots, and water, he would fear that dogs, jackals, tigers, and other ferocious animals might kill the deer. He would therefore always take the deer with him when entering the forest. Please repeat. When Maharaj Bharat
When Maharaj
wanted to enter the forest
wanted to enter the forest,
to collect kusha grass,
to collect kusha grass,
flowers,
flowers,
wood, leaves, fruits, roots, and water, he would fear that dogs, jackals, tigers, and other ferocious animals
and other precious animals
might kill the deer.
might kill the deer.
He would therefore
He would therefore
always take the deer with him
always take the deer with him
when entering the forest.
when entering the forest.
Purport by Srila Prabhupada ki. How Maharaj Bharat increased his affection for the deer is described herein. Even such an exalted personality as Bharat Maharaj, who had attained loving affection for the Supreme Personality of Godhead, fell down from his position due to his affection for some animal. Consequently, as will be seen, he had to accept the body of a deer in his next life. Since this was the case with Bharat Maharaj, what can we say of those who are not advanced in spiritual life, but who become attached to cats and dogs? Due to their affection for their cats and dogs, they have to take the same bodily forms in the next life, unless they clearly increase their affection and love for the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Unless we increase our faith in the Supreme Lord, we shall be attracted to many other things. This is the cause of our material bondage. Om Jnana Timirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshuramaниtam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupkadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shiguro Shri Tapadakamalam Shigurun Vaishnavam Shah Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raganatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shivashakan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabando Jagatpate Gopisha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Taptakanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sita Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanshikapatarubhyascha Kamusundabhyevacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. In one purport in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Srila Prabhupada says it's the duty of the spiritual master to train the disciple in such a way that he will remember the personality of Godhead at the time of death. So Bharat Maharaj was instructed personally by his father Rishabdev, and as we've read from his Rishabdev considered him the most elevated of all of his sons, many of whom were very elevated renunciants. And we've read in previous chapter how Maharaj Bharat actually attained ecstasy by meditating in mystic trance on the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vasudeva. So he certainly had followed the instructions of his spiritual master up until this point. Um, and yet he was still he still fell down from that position. So we can understand from this that that we always need to feel the necessity of having the protection of the spiritual master through his instructions. Maharaj Bharat actually was performing daily sadhana, worshipping the sun god, worshipping the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And as we read here, he was collecting different paraphernalia for his summit. It's described firewood. So this was indicating that he was performing daily fire sacrifices and offering different items. So even though he was on a very elevated platform of attachment to Krishna, still he was performing his prescribed duties. So we can understand that this also was an instruction from his spiritual master. It's described in the fifth chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Srila Prabhupada, in 2 verses, an intelligent person does not take pleasure in does not delight in contact of the senses with their objects. Such pleasures have a beginning and end, and therefore the wise person does not delight in them. And then also in the next verse, in the purport, Srila Prabhupada says, it's the duty of the learned transcendentalist to endeavor strenuously to control desire and anger. So there, in that purport, Srila Prabhupada indicates that even someone on the highest platform still has to be constantly vigilant to control their mind and senses. So for some reason here, Bharat Maharaj didn't do that. So we don't know the Lord's reason for arranging this pastime. It is stated in later verses that Srila Prabhupada says that there's an indication that Bharat Maharaj was receiving some reaction, or not reaction, but receiving the result of some prescribed duty that he'd performed for fruitive result. At some stage in his life, he'd been performing activities with a desire to enjoy the result, and therefore he was attracted by the deer. But generally, as we can understand from reading the Srimad Bhagavatam, when great personalities become captivated by material attachment, it's often to set an example for us to follow. And Maharaj Bharat is continuously referred to as a great soul, both before his fall down and after the fall down. So we can definitely understand that this is an arrangement of the Lord. But nevertheless, whether it's an arrangement or not, thank you. Whether it's whatever arrangement, at whatever stage the Lord became involved in this pastime, we can see that Maharaj Bharat forgot the purpose of the instruction that he was receiving. He was forgetting that all of the instructions that he'd received from his father and from other sages and advisors and pure devotees who would have visited his court during his immensely long reign of this planet, that all of those instructions were to enable him to remember the personality of Godhead at the end of his life. and that the end of life means the end of life. It doesn't just mean like the last 10 years of life or the last 1 year of life. It means at the time of leaving the body. But the way in which the spiritual master guides the disciple to come to that platform will vary greatly according to the disciple's conditioning and according to their the way that they have become covered by the different modes of material nature. So we see Srila Prabhupada gave different disciples very different instructions to assist them in their Krishna consciousness. I've been reading biographies of some of Srila Prabhupada's first disciples. For example, Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj, Yamuna Devi Dasi, Giriraj Swami, Shyama Sundara Prabhu, Mukunda. And actually, it's almost like it's a different a different story being described, because the interaction with Srila Prabhupada and his disciples and the way that he guided them in their Krishna consciousness was very, very different from each other. But the purpose was there. It's training his disciples to be able to remember the Supreme Personality of Godhead at the time of death. And to be able to do that, then we also need to remember our spiritual master, and we need to remember the instructions of our spiritual master or our spiritual masters at the time of death. And that means every morning, because every night we die. We die for like 5 hours or 4 hours or 6 hours, unless, of course, Srila Prabhupada didn't die. Pure devotees don't die because they're Krishna conscious 24 hours a day. But those of us who haven't reached that platform and who basically enter into a stage of complete forgetfulness during sleep, then really that's like non-different from Bharat Maharaj just becoming attached to the deer, or as Srila Prabhupada mentions here, persons who become attached to their cats and dogs. So when we're dreaming, we're attached to so many things. So when we wake up in the morning, we should feel very thankful that somehow or other we've been allowed to survive that experience. So now let us remember the instructions of our spiritual master and prepare ourselves for the time of death. We could have died in our dream, and I don't necessarily mean died physically. Of course, that's also there. We're living in a very dangerous and violent world, and people do get killed in their sleep by thieves and gangsters and repressive governments and diseases. Now, so many people die in their sleep through disease, especially in the present pandemic. So when we wake in the morning, we should feel very thankful and, I've got another chance to remember Krishna, in my life, so that at the time of my death, I can be focused. So living in the ashram, living in the association of devotees who read Srila Prabhupada's purports regularly, then we have an opportunity to always be discussing this, so that very soon after we wake in the morning, we can remember those personalities who've been given this instruction about our everyday lives. Very soon we can remember the deities, we can remember the holy name. So this is really important. So then in that way we can get back on track quickly. Actually, considering that Maharaj Bharat lived for 10 million years, it's described, so he got back on track pretty quickly as well. One lifetime he fell down, and then in that next lifetime, even though he was born with the body of a deer, he had sufficient spiritual strength and intelligence due to his previous spiritual practices to be able to act in that body and stay away from family attachment. We are not so fortunate. Kali Yuga, where could you be born in your next life where you could just get up and go and live in an ashram of sages? As far as I know, that there might be a few places on the planet, but okay, Les Mahego. Yeah, but before you come to that stage of understanding what Les Mahego is, you have to be born into a body, and it's usually, and probably it'll be a human body, or even if so. Well, anyway, wherever it is, it's a lot harder, definitely, to find an ashram of sages in Kali Yuga than it was at the time that Maharaj Bharat took his birth as a deer. So let's accept Hitoksha's answer that if we were born in Les Mahego in our next life, let's say as a human being even, that we would in some way recognize that. Like even our acharyas, even our great acharyas, it's described that usually, quite often at a very early age, like 2 or 3 years old, they showed symptoms of being like extraordinary personalities. But generally they'd been born into like very exceptional families. So if you study the lives of those acharyas who've been born into those exceptional families, I think it would be a little presumptuous to think that we would have that opportunity, that well, at least for myself anyway, I think it would be presumptuous to think that I'm so elevated that I would be born into a family of Paramahamsas, and therefore from like the very moment that I was born, I wouldn't be entangled in any kind of Maya. Actually, in one of our acharyas, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in many of his songs, he sings that from childhood, that he was captivated by the love and motherly affection of his relatives, and he was fondled by his family members when he was a child, and he forgot that material life was a suffering condition. And then he had lots of friends at school, and he started to have pride in his kind of academic prowess. So, so we can understand from this that Bhaktivinoda Thakur is warning us that, that even if we have some spiritual credits in our bank account from practice in this life, it doesn't guarantee that we'll be born in a situation where there's no danger of being entangled. So it's very important that we remember that we're connected to these teachings, and that we feel that we're aware of that protection, and to try to instruct others without emphasizing the need for that connection is just like Bharat Maharaj trying to help the deer. Srila Prabhupada says in one purport, in text 9, Srila Prabhupada says, Bharat Maharaj became very sympathetic, but he forgot that it was impossible for him to elevate a deer to spiritual consciousness because, after all, a deer is but an animal. So similarly, it's described that although Srila Prabhupada says himself sometimes that although in the 20th century, mankind has made great advancement in technology and in economics and so many different material activities, but basically still it's a civilization of polished animals, because unless a human being understands their predicament in the material world, understands their very precarious situation, that they've come to this platform of having a human form of life after transmigrating through 8,400,000 species of life, and they've come to a platform of having the intelligence to be able to analyze their situation. And so even though they've got that very rare opportunity of being able to analyze their situation, they're using that discrimination to try to increase their entanglement. Then unknowingly they're just like building a more secure prison for themselves within the prison of the material world. They're building more little prisons. And then they're fighting with other people who've built a better prison somewhere else. And so this is the situation. So just as Bharat Maharaj couldn't help the deer because the deer was an animal, then we can't help human beings unless we can enable them to understand the nature of their entanglement in the material energy. And for us to be able to do that, then we have to connect them with the line of spiritual instruction that's coming down through all of the acharyas. And that line has to have its origin in the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. So for us to be able to do that, we don't have to be great acharyas ourselves, but we have to have a very strong connection. And the essence of that connection is understanding, it's understanding the absolute necessity of having that connection and maintaining that connection by regular activities. Bharat Maharaj fell down because he stopped his regular activities. We may have thought that he was on such a high platform that he couldn't have fallen down, that he was constantly remembering Krishna. But in the verse, always remember Krishna and never forget him, we often quote that, always remember Krishna and never forget him. And we would apply that to a pure devotee, that a pure devotee always remembers Krishna and never forgets him. But we have to apply the second part of that verse, and that is all rules and regulations act as servants to this instruction. So that doesn't mean that the rules and regulations are not important. It doesn't mean that if you remember Krishna and you never forget Krishna, then you don't have to bother about the rules and regulations because they're just the servants. No, it actually means that the purpose of all the rules and regulations is to enable us to always remember Krishna and never forget him. So therefore we should, from this, it seems that Bharat Maharaj was, Krishna used his little bit of previous karma, previous attachment to the result of some yajna that he's performed to really illustrate this point very strongly. that even if we're on a platform where we are remembering Krishna and never forgetting him, still, if we don't perform regulative activities, we'll actually fall down. Srila Prabhupada actually gave us a wonderful process that the regulative activities that we perform are actually in themselves ecstatic, just like the kirtan this morning. It's like, this is our regulative principle. We don't have to go out into the woods and collect leaves, fruits, and water, although actually it's just as difficult in one sense that we have to try to source those materials from a very contaminated kind of supply chain. So I suppose in that sense, yeah, and we could get attacked by ferocious shoppers, or ferocious rip-off merchants. And however, by Krishna's mercy, everything is being provided for us. But by Srila Prabhupada's mercy, the prescribed duties that we perform in themselves are very pleasant. They're in the association of devotees. And also they enable us to remember Krishna and never forget him. So the actual prescribed duties in themselves are hearing and chanting Krishna's pastimes. Whereas for Maharaj Bharat, it was like there was some separation. Of course, when the Brahmins were performing the sacrifices, generally they would be meditating on the Lord, thinking about asking the Lord to appear. But for ourselves, the morning program and all of our activities in maintaining the deity worship, whether it's directly on the altar or whether it's maintaining the grounds and growing nice vegetables for the deities, and then all of these things can be source of both regulative activities and remembrance with the assistance of devotees. So I'll stop there and talk to Krishna.
I'm just going to resonate the last point we made, which was Prabhupada gave a nice example the other day. He was saying the devotees started chanting, but he didn't consciously decide to stop chanting today. It was like telling the volume down, and then eventually there wasn't any volume, and then he realized he stopped chanting. So that might be making about being in the constant association of devotees. That helps us to keep on the straight and narrow. And I also thought it was interesting, right at the very beginning, you were quoting the Bhagavad Gita verse, strenuously desire, to give up strenuously desire and anger. And that just reminded me that when in Bhagavatam we started the forgiveness course, the Buddha was saying, well, it's not really so appropriate to worry about forgiveness. We chant Hare Krishna, we follow the 4 regs, do service. But if you're going to strenuously try to get free from anger, then you're going to have to be very proactive in the forgiveness front. Although you maybe can see that initially, but then when you think about it, that's what's going to have to continue.
Yeah. I've definitely personally experienced that very strong kind of symptoms of anger like arise in me at like totally unexpected times. And so I can understand from that there's a kind of reservoir of like negative emotions at some level of my consciousness. And Yeah, if we don't work on them, we won't be able to control them when they arise. They'll overpower us. Thanks very much for making that point. It reminds me of the statement that chanting Hare Krishna dissolves the false ego, but gradually dissolves the false ego, gradually. But we need all the help we can get to dissolve the false ego, because if we're faced with a situation which is unprecedented in its requirement of tolerance and forgiveness, then we want to have as little envy and false ego in our hearts as possible to be able to cope with that situation. So whatever practice our spiritual master gives to us, or our spiritual masters, whatever practices we've learned from our spiritual masters, then they're giving those practices because they understand our precarious situation. However, we can't sort of practice all of the different practices that we've heard about or learnt about, because we don't have the time or we don't have the intelligence to be able to assimilate them all and practice them all. So we need some help. We need some mentors, at least one mentor who can help us apply the instructions that we've heard, and compile a system of regulative activities by which we can reap the benefits of all of the mercy that we've received. Is there any other questions?
So in this verse, it seems like the verse from Bhagavad Gita, Vitaragi by Akroda. You see that there because Maharaj Bharat was attached to the deer, he became afraid, because sometimes we think we're attached and become fearful for ourselves, but he was fearful for the deer because he was attached to it. And then because of that, he took the deer with him wherever he went, which meant he would become even more attached. He couldn't stand to be without the deer for a moment, basically. Prabhupada also says that with attachment we have to transfer it. We're always attached to something because we're attached to Shakti, we're a marginal potency, and we either become attached to matter or to spirit. So we're just wondering about how we transfer that attachment, and how does attachment, fear and anger look once that attachment is transferred.
I understand your question correctly. Because we're attached to Shakti, we're a spiritual potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So we have most of the spiritual qualities, but in minute quantity, but by nature we're of the same nature as the Supreme Lord. And therefore we have like real spiritual attachment. We have genuine affection and love. But that becomes reflected into material attachment. So how when we in the process of trying to transfer that attachment back to Krishna, how is fear, anger, and attachment transformed? Is that your question?
Yes, so how do we transfer the attachment? It seems like fear and anger come from attachment. If we're not attached and we're not afraid to lose something, we don't get angry if we lose it or something comes upon. So how do we transfer that attachment, and then how does it look? Attachment, fear and anger with Krishna consciousness.
All right, thank you. Yeah. Well, we can apply this to, I feel that we can apply this to the situation of the material world, at the present time in 20th century. Well, anyway, in the industrial society of the last 300 years. So, not many people become very, very attached to animals in the way that Maharaj Bharat did, but a large number of people become very attached to society as a whole, to humanity, or to their own country, or and it becomes more important than their own satisfaction. So many people, act out of altruism and fear that other people will be suffering, and their whole lives are geared towards either working for a charity or starting their own business to help people, or going out and joining a revolutionary army or whatever. So many hundreds of millions of people have basically sacrificed their own interest to try to relieve the suffering of others. So devotees within ISKCON, many of them also had that motivation, or not necessarily, it wasn't necessarily their own motivation, but it was often due to not being able to find any organization in the world that really had a solution to the suffering of the world, to the suffering of people in the world. Many people came in touch with Srila Prabhupada for one reason or another, and saw that Srila Prabhupada actually was presenting a solution to the suffering of all living entities. And so having come to some point in our life, coming to the conclusion that the best thing I can do, the best thing I can do is just to give all of my energy to this person who actually understands the solution. Give all of my energy. Because Srila Prabhupada is imbibing all of the teachings of the previous acharyas, then he understands the science of engaging our anger, engaging our attachments, engaging our fears in serving the mission. So when we, so if we're feeling some attachment to, if some material attachment is coming up, or some material fear is coming up, we may think, okay, we can think back to that time before we came in contact with Srila Prabhupada. Oh, this is like the same emotion I might have been feeling on the day before I got my first book, or the day before I met my first devotee, or the day before it really sunk in that Srila Prabhupada actually has the solution to all problems. But on the day that we did actually realize the greatness of Srila Prabhupada's teachings, then we weren't feeling entangled, or we were feeling liberated from those fears at that time. So if we again feel them coming up, then we think, okay, let me be afraid of losing contact with that determination to serve. Let my attachment be to serving the instruction, just like as Maharaj Ambarish, he engaged his mind in thinking about the Lord, he engaged his desires in serving the desire of the Lord. So I don't know if that's what I got from your question. I'm sorry if it wasn't exactly what you were asking. But
yeah, I think it's part of the answers in the verse itself. So basically Krishna's saying to become free from attachment, fear and anger by being fully absorbed in me. So our material attachment means, just like Maharaj Bharat, he was totally absorbed in the deer, so much so that he couldn't be separated from him. So So it's a matter of transferring that attachment to become fully absorbed in Krishna, which means always trying to think of Krishna, trying to worship Krishna, becoming absorbed in Krishna through chanting, hearing, discussing, things like that. So when we become fully absorbed in Krishna, then our attachment transfers to Krishna. And then from what we've learned also is that fear, how that manifests when you're attached to Krishna, is that you're afraid to lose the taste for the holy name, afraid to lose the inspiration in devotional service, afraid to lose the association of devotees, afraid to lose your spiritual standing, things like that. And the anger aspect, that manifests when you see a devotee being mistreated, or you see someone offending the devotee or offending Krishna. Like Prabhupada would manifest his anger by preaching strongly against people who would try to deny Krishna by impersonalism, etc. Impersonalism and the scientists, care protection, these are three of the things that Prabhupada was quite strong about. So you can see the devotees' attachment, fear and anger manifest in that way. That's how I understood it.
Thank you very much.
I was thinking also how anger looks if you're connected to Krishna. Anger looks like Arjuna when Abhimanyu was killed, and he asked Krishna afterwards, was this, did you do this, like this, get so angry? And he became very angry, and Krishna just directed that to the kill of the souls and the formation of Java the next day. So he became, because up until he wasn't so ruthless, when warriors saw Arjuna on the battlefield the next day, they were scared to look out. He was seeing or whatever. So that's what anger looks like when it's getting to Krishna. And fear, there's so many pastimes about Krishna's with the cowboy boss. And the demon is, or the fire, forest fire, and everyone's afraid, and they run to Krishna. He says, close your eyes, and he brings in the fire. So there's so many examples of how fear and anger, what it looks like when it's connected to Krishna. Doesn't go away, still there. That's where it is pure from.
Well, it doesn't seem to be the same experience, because when Agasura, I just carrying from what you were saying, when Agasura demon was lying there across the pathway as if to swallow them all up, her boys were walking into it, and she it looks like he's going to swallow us. So they're aware that could be happening, but they're thinking, well, even if it does, we can't kill Krishna. So they carried on anyway.
The similar pastime to that is that Lord Chaitanya was rallying everyone to go to the palace of the Chankasi, and it's described in one version of that pastime is that many of the families of the Vaishnavas were terrified. They had children who were like staunch followers of Lord Chaitanya who were, taking part in the march, but they themselves, some of the children were like devotees of Lord Chaitanya, and their parents were like smarta Brahmins who were actually opposed to it. And they were thinking, oh, my son's getting involved, they'll think I'm one of them as well. So it's described that, not everybody was fearless, but that when this sort of kirtan of like 50,000 or 100,000 or 1 million Vaishnavas was coming through, then gradually everyone became caught up in the ecstasy, and even the soldiers became ecstatic. They were thinking they were going to get completely annihilated by the Vaishnavas because they were completely overwhelmed in numbers, and they were trying to hide their beards, it's described. But then, gradually they all became captivated by the Lord's potency and understood who he was. So it's that's it. That's the importance of regulative activities. That we should regularly have the experience of our fear being abated by taking the association of devotees. If we don't do that regularly, then the fear will become so great that we don't take shelter because we actually become afraid of it associating with devotees. Or we become forgetful. We become forgetful of the nature of the devotee's mercy.
Yes, well, an interesting thing about fear. So one of the concluding verses of Bhagavad Gita is, abandon all rights, surrender unto me, I will take you from all sinful actions, do not fear. So, in the process of giving up our attachments, we're afraid to do that, but Krishna is advising us, don't be afraid. So there's a book called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. So the fact is, we do feel afraid, but we do it. If we know, okay, according to Guru said in Shastra, we should do this, we're afraid, but do it anyway, and then you overcome the fear. The fear is only there because we're not doing it yet. Once you step, it's just like the example was given that your friends are swimming in the pool, and you're afraid to go in case it's too cold or something. But then once you jump in, then you're over that fear. So that thing can help devotees overcome their fears when they're trying to surrender to Krishna. It's okay, yeah, you are afraid, you can feel that fear, but do it anyway, because by doing it, you'll overcome the fear. The fear will always be there as long as we
Fear will what?
It will always be there as long as we shy away from it, and as long as we stay on the shore, we don't go into the ocean, we'll always be afraid.
In the words of Winston Churchill, we have nothing to fear, but fear itself.
Prancha Srimad Bhagavatam ki,
Jai.
Srila Prabhupada ki,
Jai.
Ananta Koti Vaishnavinda ki, Jai, Nitai Gaura Premanandi. Hare Krishna. Shri Karuna Bhavandam ki, Jai.
Yes, we show us some information.